Oh, my. I really don't know how to follow that. But I'm going to give it a try. That was so lovely, so gracious, and I'm so grateful for it. Thank you so much. I will treasure that, as I treasure altogether the invitation to be the Lyman Beecher lecturer. For your graciousness, for everybody's graciousness, I'm so deeply grateful. I need to say that now, because they do want us out of here quickly. So at any rate, before we enter the theme for today, we're a little overdue for one last word from really the first and second lectures. I promised that I would talk about a new form of plot, a new form of narrative preaching, or of plotted kind of preaching. Buttrick would call it plotted mobility, and that's what I want to do. In fact, I've mentioned to Tom Torger many times that he is exactly the right person to write some on this subject. So I'm going to issue that invitation again, but I do want to just name what I think ought to be explored by those of us who care for preaching. And that is what I've mentioned ever so briefly in some writings, what I call episodal preaching. We've talked about plotted mobility with Buttrick, and we've talked about inductive with Craddock. We've talked about conversational with Lucy Rose, transformational in other contexts. We've talked about a lot of different kinds, and in a sense they could all come under the notion of narrative preaching, except other people would like to name their own system as better than this. At any rate, I'd said that there had not been much written on this subject, but I may have to change my mind today if I change the definition of the work of David Buttrick. And that is, I've always called he calls them plotted mobility, and I've always thought of them very much as narrative preaching. He has these moves, 5 or 6 moves that move toward the resolution of the text. Only I've said, in fact, in Princeton, I don't call them moves, I call them stops. In a sense, the move is what happens implicitly between the first, whatever we call it, and the second and the third and the fourth. And the reason I just called it similar to mine is for the fact that on several occasions I have looked at manuscripts of David Buttrick's preaching on texts that I also have preached on and noticed. In one case, in fact, I wrote in the margins, oops, ugh, aha, we, yeah, in exactly the same order as I would cover it. However, there is one thing that makes me willing to change my mind about that, and that is, unlike my attempt to always lead in to the next segment, David Buttrick closes it down. Some of you know his rules for the move, as he calls it, how you start it up and then you close it down. And there's this jump then to the next section. And because of that, they seem to be separate entities. So to call them episodes, I think, is a way to talk about it. And then there's Craddock, and he calls himself inductive preaching. He calls him narrative preacher. He calls himself a lot of different kinds of terms. But what I notice about Fred Craddock is that he may be into the middle of a text, and we're going for the ride on the text. All of a sudden, he's out of the text altogether. He never warns you. He never signals before turning. All of a sudden, we're in aisle 11 of the supermarket we've been going to for 10 years. And you say, well, how did we get there? Well, Fred just moved to the 11th aisle of the supermarket. And what we know is that he's going to spot something in the aisle 11 that we have never noticed for the 10 years we've been walking through. He will spot it and name it. And then first thing you know, he's off to another text. That's the way he works, which is so clearly episodal. I always try to have a thin line that pulls from one section to the other. He doesn't need it because you know you're with Fred, and whatever's going to happen will be just fine. And well, what I like to do is to make a thin line. I remember one time listening to some symphony, some group. I don't remember what they were playing in what key, but what I remember was this: when they got through with the first movement, the conductor brought it to this decisive stop, and I knew we were ready for the second movement. Except there was one instrument still playing. It was an oboe, and it was not a mistake. It was the oboe that was going to be the line, the thin line that was going to move us. Because what happened is that if this is the key we were in, then when everything stopped, do you hear the one note? And in short, the note that was the fifth of the root in the first case now becomes the third in the new key sign. And that's the way I always recommend that people make transitions between movements. Never a big hunk of stuff going from one spot to the other. Most people won't make the jump. But if you take a thin line, and it's often very helpful. Well, those who do apostolic preaching sometimes are more implicit rather than explicit. And Tom is the one I want to talk about now. In fact, I have a couple of pages of a book of his, because it's worth noting. And this was in a book, Imagine His Sermon in 1990. And I want to read a little bit of it quickly, because I want you to notice how he made the shift. It was the sample rhetorical sermon for the print generation, and I knew who he meant. He meant me and others like me. And he said, I turn on the word processor, and he's getting the sermon going. In a few moments, Catherine and Jonathan will repeat their vows, I promise and covenant before God and all these witnesses to be faithful and loving husband, wife, husband, and for better, for worse, you know the commitment there. Promise and covenant, he says, what antique words they are to our ears. Something one might find carved in Romanesque letters. Promise and covenant, not the words of everyday speech. He said they're the words not words we use at a coffee break. They are sacred words. We remember Abraham and Sarah, et cetera, et cetera. They remind us that God has made a promise. It will guide us, support us, and to love us, and so forth. A promise and covenant, these are words that are deeper than feeling. And he talks about that love is more than feeling. Idea is hard to grasp. And so they don't change with moods, he says. Promise and covenant, the rest of your life, to remember these. When your bodies fail from illness, that spoke the words to each other, et cetera, et cetera. And he's about through with this. He said he didn't particularly like it. He didn't put it that way, but it's clear he didn't, because he chose something else. And so he decides to do a sermon for this wedding that's a sample visual sermon for the mass media generation. And here's how he starts. Notice the utter difference. He said, I once met a couple who told me that every anniversary they donned their wedding clothes and had their picture taken in the living room of their house. They planned to do it throughout their life together and collect the photographs in an album. As you, Catherine and Jonathan, stand before this congregation in your wedding clothes, I'm remembering this other couple, so forth. I imagine them in their 5th anniversary coming down the living room for the picture. She's in her white gown and he's wearing the 3-piece suit. They're waiting for the next door neighbor who's gone to get some extra flash cubes. Now, it's very important to remember what he did here, because by the time this happened, flash cubes were history. Now, they did reinvent them later, but I found out when they died the first time. He did that on purpose. The first 4 years they hired a professional photographer, but this has not been a good year. Husband's lost a job. The wife's only able to get a part-time employment. The neighbor arrives, positions them, and say, all right now, while their friend, don't lose the lines, while their friend fidgets with the focus. Don't you love that? Fidgets with the focus. The wife notices the stuffing's coming out of the sofa, etc. Flash, that's number one. The wife says, do you remember our vows? They think a moment, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor. The word bursts like the flash cubes on their friend's camera, etc. We promised that'll be a good one 10 years later. They're much better financially. The husband has a good job. The wife went back to school. It's taken an excellent position. The love seats have been fixed, and so forth. The children have 10-speed bicycle, but the husband and wife have thrown acid words at one another. The second child, although strips to the doctor, is in trouble. Each partner said to the other, if you were not so preoccupied with your job and give some time to the family, things would be different. And then they trek up to the attic to get the musty clothes. The doorbell rings, the photographer comes, smile for the camera, they click away, and they think about the promised, the loving, faithful, and then the worst flashes as poorer did 10 years before. And again, the looks we promised. Then we get to the 47th anniversary. They don't know whether they'll make it to their 50th. He had 2 heart attacks. Her hands are crooked with arthritis. The granddaughter herself engaged is upstairs bringing down the old clothes. And you can imagine the clever and humorous way he describes them trying to get their clothes on, as long as the picture is taken from the waist up. He takes his wife's hands, as her knuckles swollen and knobby out of the faltering bodies. I do covenant before God and these witnesses, they say to each other, that to be your faithful and so forth. So, in sickness unto death, words that slipped easily out of their mouth in their wedding day are heavy with meaning. I'm going to go up to get more film, says the granddaughter. They're not listening. They're looking at each other. They see something more beautiful than the prized pictures in the anniversary album, The Grace and Glory of a Promise Kept. That is our prayer for you, Catherine. Jonathan, that for better, for worse, richer, for poor, sickness and health, until death do you part, you may know the grace and glory. Do you hear what happens? I mean, in one sense you could say, we have exactly the same content. But you really can't say that because he's put it in such a different form that it may have the similar content, but in fact it's powerful this time. It's not deductive, going down to the little things. It starts, the glue for the new sermon are pictures. That's the thin line that holds this segment from this segment to this segment to this segment. Do you hear what I'm saying? That is powerful episodal preaching. And that's why it seemed to me that he's the right one to talk about it. He's been doing it for so long. The other thing I want to say about Plotted is that I noticed the difference in TV between my 1980 book and now. And it's altogether different. Some of you here old enough to remember Columbo? Okay, Columbo, you know the detective in the trench coat. Even if he's in Arizona at a pool in the middle of August, he's got the trench coat on. And he's asking inane questions of inane people. And pretty soon you know it's coming around because he's going to the office of somebody who we already know is the villain. We know more than Columbo knows. But so he goes in and asks questions, and they seem like this is not going anywhere. And then Columbo heads toward the door. You've seen him go to the door, but he doesn't go out the door. He turns back with the cigar and says, one more question. And you say, this is it. And he asks the question. You say, well, how's that a clue? He doesn't know, but he's ahead of us who do know. Or another one would be Quincy, the pathologist. You know, he's trying to figure out either why somebody died or who caused the death. And he runs around, and you know he always runs into trouble. He never can find the answer. He does everything he can possibly do. Finally, he does something really stupid. It's like he's pushing himself off a wall, and everybody says, you're going to make all of us embarrassed. But somehow, by the time he falls off the cliff, he lands on his feet without hurt, and there's a revelation as to what in fact was going on, and they go to a restaurant and break bread together. It seems only appropriate that they would do that. The point is that nothing happens well until in fact nothing can, and that's when the reverse takes place. And then there are those who watched Dukes of Hazzard. Now, many of my students would not admit that they ever watched Dukes of Hazzard, and I can tell that some of you have and will not say so here. But in Dukes of Hazzard, no matter where things are, the Dodge Charger and its occupants are in the wrong place. And so if the real thing is happening downtown, they're at the county line, or vice versa. And you know they have to turn around quickly as he jumps in the car through the window and gets the engine going, and they never make that turn on concrete or asphalt. It's always dirty dust. And so as they make the 180-degree turn, you can see the dust and dirt rise, and you know you could name it. You could name it. The name is called reversal. That's it. You can't miss it. You can't miss it. But now we don't have things like that. We have MASH, or had MASH, in which, in one sense, who's injured is really movable. What's not movable is the interaction among the staff. And therefore, you get the ongoingness of the staff. Or you can turn to NYPD Blue or Boston Legal that always leaves, they got the interaction of the staff, but Boston Legal always leaves one case not solved, right? It's going to have to come to court next time. And then, of course, Grey's Anatomy. Anybody watch Grey's Anatomy? Oh, all right, yes. Well, I want to know who's sick here. The patient or the staff? Well, at any rate, the point is that we've got subplots working underneath the larger plot. You still have a strategic delay in resolution. That's my point. It may be done episodally. It may be more implicit linearity, but it follows the Aristotelian movement as we dealt with yesterday. So, at any rate, that's why I think we need to work some more with regard to that which may be more current for younger generations. And that's episodal preaching, another form of plotted sermons. Now we come to recovering the voice of orality. And I want us to note, just as we begin recovering the voices of orality, is to note, sometimes a touch of humor may accidentally reveal a deeper issue. Or is it that a deeper issue, once it's revealed by someone surprisingly, will cause the humor? But some of you heard the apocryphal, no doubt, story of someone supposing accounting of an altogether too eager, too vocal participant in a very important meeting. This is an overeager type. You've met them, I'm sure, and they want to get their 2 cents worth in, and that's the way other people evaluate the contribution. And when it took you a moment, but thank you. So anyway, the convener of the important meeting takes the person aside at the first break and says, thank you so much for coming and the contributions you've made thus far in our meeting. Now, in order for greater participation, I urge you to be a little more timid or reticent in how many times you offer your views. In fact, it would really be good if you would resist making a contribution until you actually know what you want to say. And the person says, well, how will I know what I think? Until I hear myself say it. And now, that's probably not a good candidate for preaching ministry. But that person represents all of us, one way or the other, whether we're preachers here or not. And that is not because we are only worth 2 cents in our contributions, anything like that, and not that we're overeager or anything like that. But what I mean is, if we linger a moment and think about what the little story was about, there's a basic reality that's in it, and that is the spoken word tends to prompt thought. Have you noticed? The spoken word almost always prompts new thought. So, for example, somebody comes up and asks you, what do you think about subject X? And you've been working with Y and Z. And you have a feeling about X, but you haven't been thinking about it lately. It's not right here. And when they ask you, what do you think about it? You say, well, it's not been on my mind here lately, but, well, let me give it a try. And you say, well, yada, yada, yada. And, oh, no, that's not quite what I mean. Let me try it again. Yada, 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 yada. You say, and they say, oh, well, and of course, you have to, there are a couple of exceptions to this principle. Oh, and you notice that it depends on the context in which the situation is found. Now, do you hear what's going on in there? The truth is that when we talk, we not only think about what we're saying, we think about what we did not say. And it prompts us to move on. Utterly different from writing. it tends to do the exact reverse. As Walter Wrong said in the Terry Lectures on the campus of Yale University some years back, he said, spoken words are free-moving, fleeting even, but what is written stays put. It is a record. It holds words so they do not escape. Do you hear that? Well, I remember something my dear friend and good colleague, Dr. Tex Sample, said to me one time a number of years ago. We were in some institutional conflict or whatever. I don't know what it was, but I remember what he said. He said, I know you feel strongly on this subject. And I, of course, did. And he said, I don't know how you're going to communicate your views, but I have a suggestion for you. And that is, whatever you do, do not put it in writing. There. He said, because if you do, there's very little wiggle room from there. Because he says, when you put it down, it's done. Well, why would he have said that? Well, he must have read Walter Wrong. That's all I can figure. That words provide a record. It holds the words so they cannot escape. No wonder Fred Craddock one time gave this warning to us all. Let a preacher begin thinking that the point is to get Sunday's sermon written and a string of negative results will follow. First, the written sermon is a kind of closure, which offers not only a sense of satisfaction, thank God I'm through with this, but also a shutting down of germination and gestation, often prematurely. And moreover, he said, to make writing the sermon the goal of the process is to cause one to think writing rather than speaking throughout the preparation process. You hear that? Which, the way I'm saying is that the act of writing itself encourages closure. Writing loves complete sentences, properly produced, good grammar, privileging the nouns, of course, and moving. Of course, we all like closure more than lack of closure anyway, but writing loves complete sentences with a big, fat period at the end. And no wonder that gestation and germination may in fact escape and just come down. But so no wonder 2 years later Walter Wrong wrote another book and noted that with print it's even worse. He said print is comfortable only with finality. And so it is that the primary point of a period is to shut down thought. The primary point of a period is to shut down thought. On the other hand, oral speech loves run-on sentences, utterly different. As Kirk Byron Jones says in this wonderful little book, The Jazz of Preaching, he says the mysterious common ground between preaching and jazz is that one never arrives. That is, the wells are always deeper, and there's always more. So I want to say, keep talking. Not just in the doing, but in the preparation. Now, you understand, Fred Craddock was not against writing, but he wanted it as a servant to the goal of oral speech called the sermon. In fact, he speaks of the large differences in shaping thought between one thought that is geared to be taken in by the eyes and thought taken in by the ears, altogether different. He said, preaching has to do with mouth to ear communication, encounters, not hand to eye. I say, what you see is out there. What you hear is in here. Utterly different. And one can sometimes trump the other. That is, seeing and hearing have different points of power. Depends on the context in part. For example, here's a board meeting. You've been given the responsibility to provide the persuasive speech for this important advance in the work of the organization. You've worked hard to get a persuasive speech going. You also have a fact sheet prepared and handy, hoping that by the time people get on board with the possibility of entertaining this wonderful future, they can see, in fact, the group can do it. And but you're by the time you're into about sentences 11, 12, and 13, you discover somebody inadvertently didn't hear your instructions. and they've started handing out the fact sheet. Well, you know what happens, don't you? They're not going to hear a word you say for the next 10 minutes. They're going to be, because it's in front of their face. And they'll not. Some will be reading some other place in it, and some at the top, and so forth. Particularly the ones who don't like the idea to begin with. They're looking for the reason why they can retort once your persuasive speech is over. And you just well stop and go through the fact sheet. Now, it's the wrong sequence. You notice the word, don't you, with me? Sequence. It's the wrong sequence. You'll never be able to gain the power that you would have had if you had been able to keep moving your powerful speech. So after you go through it, you say, well, as I was saying earlier, and you go back. Now, in that case, the I wins. But on the deeper level, another level, what you find is the reverse is altogether the case. And I remember, this says something about how old I am. When I was growing up, I used to listen to the Lone Ranger. I don't suppose anybody here is old enough to have heard the Lone Ranger. Nobody's raising their hands. There, somebody did. Thank you for your honesty. Anyway, any rate, I remember, the plot was wonderful, and of course the Lone Ranger wound up saving the world. Of course, the Lone Ranger had to be saved by Tonto. In fact, the fact that Tonto's around suggests that he's not lone, but he was an ethnic but he's an ethnic minority, and therefore did not count. They had to change the name when they sent it south of the border because of the word T-O-N-T-O, which I can't pronounce correctly in Spanish, but it isn't helpful. It isn't something anybody would want to be called. At any rate, so he wins the day and gets on that horse, and then the William Tell overture cranks up. Oh, it is so bold, it's so noble, it's wonderful. Oh, and the horse, the steed riding under the Lone Ranger as he goes out, and somebody asked, what's the question he asked? Who was that masked man? Something like that. The horse was as noble as the William Tell overture. One generation later, I walked through the room that has the television in it, and my children are watching the Lone Ranger show. And I stopped to listen. Oh, yes, the plot is just as good as it was. And it moves out, and sure enough, Tonto saves the Lone Ranger saves the world, and goes riding off to the noble and bold William Tell overture. But you wouldn't believe the puny pony that's underneath the Lone Ranger. He should have been retired long ago. How could that happen? You see, what I'm saying is, when you prompt imagination in the mind by means of orality, the picture that happens is most likely far more powerful than someone can see on the back of a bulletin or on a screen somewhere. It prompts it. And in this case, it's interiorly present and far more powerful than the hearing is far more powerful than the seeing. It's got the inside track. And the battle goes on beyond that. A scripture lesson for Sunday. I'm going somewhere and preaching for Sunday, and I look at the bulletin in advance, on the back page is the printing of the text for this morning. And I'm not happy with that. You see, I don't want people getting the text by means of pale, lack of power print on the back of a bulletin. I want the human voice to be able to help the word be heard. And when they don't put it in the back, they say, turn to page 127. And I don't want 127. I want, well, for example, in the call of Simon, in the Luke version, remember he's preaching. he's borrowed a boat. You know, the people are beginning to gather on that amphitheater, natural amphitheater, and they gather shoulder to shoulder. More and more people coming. The sun has just come up, and people are gathering because they want to hear the word. That's what the text says. They're eager to hear the word, and they get shoulder to shoulder so tight. I think the reason he needed a boat was they might just push him into the water. The crowd is so big. I suppose that's every preacher's dream. At any rate, he preaches from the boat. And when he gets through, he turns to Simon and says, why don't we push out and let down the nets for a catch? That is the most absurd request you could possibly imagine. Could he not see that all the fishermen along the way next to the Sea of Galilee, they're all washing their nets? Why are they washing their nets? Because it's morning. Because the sun has come up. Your day's work is done when the sun comes up. Didn't Jesus know about fishing? This is a bad text for him not to know much about fishing. Anyway, the text only gives us 2 sentences of response. And you know he said more than that. He had to have said more than that. I can imagine his saying something like, you see the nets being clean, you know why. And we love, you're a good talker, Jesus, and we love to hear you. Well, I'm a fisherman and I'm a pro. And I know when to fish and when not to fish. Well, I don't know whether he said it, but he should have if he didn't. At any rate, they just give us one sentence. But Master, we've worked all night long and have not caught anything. You hear the thing in the voice? It didn't appear on the print. You heard my voice, didn't you, how I said it? And then, well, I have to say it that way so that people feel the radicality of such a thing with a long pause. And then the resignation of the second line when he says, but if you say so, we'll let down the nets. Do you hear it? Well, I don't want the bulletin to have it, or on the screen for that matter. And then there's always the business of the fill in the blanks. A complicated bulletin that somewhere talks about how little we remember from what we hear, and therefore has a fill in the blanks thing. You noticed it. This is a phrase that needs you to remember, and the new pastor is really eager. The new pastor is eager for you to know which words to put where, so you remember them, And so you keep half listening, half looking, and missing most of what is being said. Oh, there's the sentence. Oh, no, it wasn't. And then later, oh, this is it. Yes. By the time you get it written down, well, the preacher is 10 to 12 sentences on. You'll be lucky to catch up. Well, why do things like that happen? Because some people think the primary goal of a sermon is memory of information. And that's not the primary purpose of a sermon. As Henry Mitchell says, it's simple, it's a behavioral aim. Or Brueggemann says the event of preaching is an event of transformed imagination to destabilize all our settled facts, the goal of altered behavior. Or Buttrick, who's trying to form a corporate consciousness in the congregation. Those are the goals of preaching. It's not memory of instruction or information. So I say every time you put a period on a page, watch out. It says, we're done. And maybe we don't want to be done. Oh, the human voice, the power of the human voice, As Ong said, the sound unites groups of living beings as nothing else does. Notice the difference in the separation. For the writer writes alone most of the time. May imagine a lot of people who may read the writing. But most of those people will be reading the writing alone as well. Whereas the speaker shares with. It is the difference between isolation and communication. Oh, and then what wonders we have in the technology of the word. I mean, for long distances, we used to have to use the Morse code on telegraph, And then we got telephone lines everywhere in the world, or a lot of places. Yeah, and then we had phones that weren't attached to the base. We could walk all around the house with a phone in our hand. And then the cell phone. Oh, the blessed cell phone. Oh, it's so wonderful. You can hear your beloved. You hear the nuance of the voice. Even if they're asking a difficult question, why did you do that? You hear the love that is inside even the question. And it's enormous. Or you can also hear the angularity of a parishioner who's unhappy. You can hear the closeness of the. But now, alas, some people don't want that close a connection. They'd rather have a little distance. And so the technology has made it possible for us to have distance, and here it is, that you can text the thing and stay clear, free and clear from the other. And as a matter of fact, it's not as fast as the Morse code. There have been several tests here recently of experts of Morse code and experts of texting to see who could receive a paragraph of information. And in every case, Morse code wins. So it's kind of a reverse evolution, don't you think? At any rate, the other thing is you get to pay extra for the privilege of texting. So at any rate, Jay Leno one time asked Billy Crystal, he said, "Do you Twitter?" And he said, "No, I can talk." So Fred Craddock and Walter Ong joined Billy Crystal there in noting the enormous corporate power of the human voice. And Craddock, who's right, who said writing is for reading, speaking is for listening. Not just presentation, but preparation. I know there's sometimes that it's important. That is, you remember the so-called election in Iran. Twittering was helpful in terms of protest. They couldn't quite follow up and arrest people as quickly as other forms of communication. And I remember 9/11 and my preaching in a church in Manchester, Missouri, at the end of that week. And I called the pastor right away. I said, "It sounds to me like we need to postpone my appearance." He said, "Well, it might seem so," but he said, "We planned the events of the weekend for a long time now." He said, "I tell you what, I need to make a presentation to the congregation before you read your text and preach." And I changed the text because I had one that was pretty celebrative, which wouldn't fit if I had done any congregational exegesis. And so he did arrive, and it was a text written and copies in the narthex, because he needed to be able to have absolute precision so he could not be misunderstood. And those are important. And even Facebook can be helpful sometimes in the life of a congregation. But for most of us, and what I want to say particularly is that the things that really are powerful toward us are the things we don't notice. And it's important to notice the difference of literality and orality. So I say, can't we leave the world of the manuscript on Sunday and just let it fly with orality? Well, it's not likely. It's not likely because you see the note you make, the manuscript of the note you make, is just the final coup de grace of a whole bunch of texts. You started with a lectionary text that's in print, remember, on here, and you get 4 choices, unless you try to combine them. Not my option, but at any rate, you bought several books on year A, just pitched for the Sunday you're preparing, and so you read those texts, and then some journals as well. You get those as well, and of course the internet is so easy, so quick. You can get borrowed sweat, In fact, what you find out is that there's no sweat at the other end. But at any rate, all these texts have groomed us to closure, groomed us into thinking language of literality, not orality. And let me tell you about the lectionary. Does it ever love closure? Oh, and finality. You just read those year A journals and books, and you'll find finality. There are exceptions, but they're rare. When you hear what they say, the purpose of the Revised Common Lectionary, listen to provide whole churches or denominations with uniform and common pattern of biblical proclamation. They want it all together, don't they? You hear the tightness of that? Did you hear it? Uniform, common, pattern. And have you noticed that there are often gaps in the selection? You got verses 1 through 6 and 12 through 18. Well, what happened 7 to 11? Well, something real interesting they don't want you to notice. And in fact, you don't have to notice it. You can buy one of those books that have all the 4 texts right on one page. You don't have to don't even have to own a Bible. You just look at the text right there. Well, Joey Jeter said it better than anybody from Bright Divinity School, but he said, and I quote, "When verses are missing from a lectionary text, it's most often because the missing verses are trouble. And the lectionary does not like trouble. It's not designed for preaching per se. It's designed for worship, and each service of worship is to be complete in and of itself, offering a holistic experience of the gospel truth for the day. Discordant texts with interior or proximate conflicts are often either edited or ignored." You remember the illustration that Nora Tisdale gave of the project that somebody did, took 3 cities and interviewed 24 pastors at the Gulf War of '91, the first Sunday after, and asked the pastors how did they deal with that excursion into the Gulf the Sunday following the event. And most everybody reported they didn't say anything about it because they follow the lectionary. They follow the lectionary. Well, you're not likely, if you don't follow the world's events, you're not likely to notice anything in the parish either. Now, and then let's just take a couple of wonderful options that the lectionary has given us. Now I need to say, when I talk to students, those who don't use the lectionary, I say start at once. And those who like the lectionary and use it, I say, think about stopping right away. I generally want to go against their natural inclination. It's kind of the way I do it. Any rate, for example, just a few passages. Let's take All Saints' Day coming up, year C. And they chose Daniel, the 7th chapter. Isn't that wonderful for All Saints' Day? Oh, gosh, how wonderful. I mean, you got a fiery furnace, den of lions. You got civil disobedience. You got the king of Babylon tabled, I mean, when you think about the saints, you include the martyrs. You imagine people who engage in civil disobedience, take a stand in the name of Christ. Oh, Daniel is perfect. No, not the passage they selected. They selected, you understand, Daniel 7, 1 to 3 and 15 to 18. Are you suspicious? Well, verses 1 through 3 talk about the 4 beasts in the water coming up. But they don't care about the beasts in the water, let me tell you. Because the explanation for why the beasts are and what they are about starts at verse 4. And they drop it all together. They don't want that. They want to jump to 15. Well, what's in the 15 to 18? Well, I think maybe somebody did a computer word search. And they put the word in S-A-I-N-T-S. And guess what they came up with? They came up with Daniel 7:18. And the saints shall persevere. That's what they did. Well, not if you read the new RSV now, because they changed it to the holy ones. So if you read that, you'll never know why they chose this text. The sad thing is there could have been spies sneaking a peek into the window of resolute faithfulness, but we didn't get it. With Galatians, I'm going to have to be really quick. I see that. But I want to mention that they have some lovely passages out of Galatians. I think 6 in a row, and it starts off well because the first one is the first 12 verses of chapter 1 when he says, I'm astonished you're quickly deserting, and later says, am I a crowd pleaser now? By God I'm not lying to you, or some phrase like that in that first 12 verses. But we don't get to hear that because Pentecost and Trinity Sunday take precedence. And so when it comes up in 2013, it will not have been there, that passage, for 18 years. That's how long. So at any rate, they'll pick it up 1:11 to 24. It's the part about the trip, the 3 years. It's mild, no problem there. Then what they leave out is the second trip after 14 years. You remember that. He says, we did not submit. He's pretty strong about that. He says, not to those who's supposed to be somebody, not that there is such a thing as that. And then also, they've left out this, it's just too much. When the Antioch situation happened and Peter stood condemned, even Barnabas was carried away with the insincerity. To have the two biggest heroes in the Christian movement arguing over what's central to the gospel. Too much. Let's just leave the Judaizers nameless and faceless. See? It's easy to battle them, not to have a real argument. And so they're going to leave that out. And so then they move to the rest of the chapter, which has to justified by faith in Jesus Christ, no longer I who live. That's good. But, chapter 3:1, dear stupid Galatians, I'm astonished. Who has bewitched you? You can't do that on Sunday. And besides that, the law is called a curse. Well, they're going to wait. They're going to get to the law only after verse 3:23, where the law is a disciplinarian until Christ. That's easier. I think they can stomach that. And then, then in 4, once again, he says, I'm afraid my work has been wasted. Am I now your enemy? But then they go to 5, I live by the Spirit. They skipped. They did 5:1-13. Well, guess what they missed there? Verse 12 said, I wish those who trouble you with the laws of circumcision and food stuff, I wish the knife would slip. That's a cutting remark. Too strong. Finally, they get to God is not mocked, follow peace, but they leave out the last 2 verses, of course. The last 2 verses say, don't anybody trouble me from now on. Grace. That's what they left out. But the biggie for the last 3 minutes here, before I have to move to the next little bit, is Jonah. Now, there's one little thing that's an optional one later. It has the same problem. But anyway, there's Jonah. It's Jonah 3, 1-5 and 10. What happened to chapters 1 and 2? Well, if you need an itch to move to scratch, and it needs to be a textual itch, I think you heard me say something like that 2 days ago. They took the itch out. Well, we don't have any disobedience. It's supposed to go north and east, but he went south and west. And he gets this ship, and there's no water in when you get to 3, and there's no storm, and there's no sailors who ironically are praying to their gods while he's asleep in the bottom of the boat. Now, who's the religious leader on the boat? Please tell me. At any rate, and so and then remember, he said, well, if you throw me overboard, the sea will quiet down for you. And you notice how virtuous they are? They didn't do it immediately. They unloaded more cargo trying to get to land, but couldn't make it. And so finally, heave ho, they throw him off, and he hits the water. Wow. Judgment rendered. Judgment he had coming. But there's more than judgment. There's also mercy. There's mercy. Because just as he hits the water, there's a celestial seagoing taxicab along about that time that gobbles him whole. Now, he does, that's grace. The very moment when judgment is rendered, grace is offered. That will preach. But no, we don't get it. Well, he probably didn't think that he was being grace-filled. He had a very self-serving prayer after that, a little bit, after getting used to the fish. And he said, my life is ebbing away, and I thought of you, God. Nonsense. His life is ebbing away, and God thought of him. That's different altogether. Well, finally, of course, as we know, the fish vomits. You could say the fish repents. Everybody repents in this story except Jonah, even God and even the Ninevites, etc. But at any rate, so we get to 3, and we say it's the second call. Once he gets the goo and muck off his arms and can see again out of the blindness of the dark, well, Jonah heads into town 3 days across. 1 day in, he starts yelling. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't mention God. He doesn't mention sin. He doesn't mention judgment. All he says is 40 days and you're out of here. And then comes the moment of the king. But they stop it right there. Because it's the verses 6, 7, 8, and 9 talk about the king, and the sackcloth and ashes. Even the animals, the cats and dogs, wearing sackcloth and ashes. And it is he who's the resident theologian here. I think Jonah didn't want him to respond. Do you think that? But the resident theologian, the king, said maybe this is not God's last word. It is stricken from the record that is offered by the lectionary. And it doesn't mention either his terrible response once they are saved. He knows the theology, grace that's empowering, mercy, womb love, hesed, that continues on. He knew it. He just hated all of it. He hated it so much he wanted to die. Oh, we don't get that part of the story either. At any rate, they leave out. Now, what I want to say is, what do you do when you go to the commentaries on Jonah 3, 1 to 5 and 10? Well, I did a little research project of over 20 of the people who help us with this year and so forth and so on. And if you want more closure, we got it now. And now there were a few wonderful, against the grain, against the press of print, and rather moving toward the vantage of the voice. 4 issues emerged. First of all, what do you do with the missing chapters? Well, most of them just ignored it. Well, not Elizabeth Ochtemeyer, the late great. She knew exactly what. She said, in order to bring the congregation to the point at which the morning text begins, it's necessary for the preacher briefly to recount the story that precedes our text. Note, she said recount, not barely, if at all, mention. She said recount it. And notice, she didn't say the preacher's text. Do you get that? She said our text. You see, she imagines she's already at church. Oh, well. But most of them just avoided her, barely mentioned. One said that Jonah didn't want to go. That was the take. That's two chapters worth. The other said, this is a story relating reluctance and now finally submission. There's your sermon. Well, not a good one. One was happy to have avoided the fish that catch preachers in trouble. And 1/4 of them didn't say anything, and the half of the rest only said either one sentence or 2. The other thing is, of course, the cursory statements of summary statements for the sermon. One said, this is the story of repentance. Well, one said there are 4 possibilities for the theme, and had 1 sentence each for each of the 4. And one was an essay that lasted 800 words, and Jonah was the subject of the sentence once. And tangential detours, one said it's a fishing for converts is the theme here. And one thought serendipity was the subject. Another said Jonah was fish bait. And another just said, the issue here is the creeds. And then lacking connection to the congregation's world. And Elizabeth Ochtemeyer, again, her very first sentence was this: anyone who still holds the old stereotypical opinion that the God of the Old Testament is wrathful and judgmental in contrast to the God of the New, who is loving and merciful, should carefully study the book of Jonah. You expect that of Elizabeth Ochtemeyer, don't you? Oh, that's so wonderful indeed. That's something to get the mind off the page. And it was J. Howard Wallace of the faculty at Melbourne, Australia, who connected it to our day, who said, in a world where serious voices, be they religious, political, economic, or military, would tell us why we cannot break the boundaries we've set up to keep others at a distance. Oh, whereas on the other hand, in the text of Jesus, and then he said with the story of Jonah, of God's disarming humor, which challenges every life-denying limitation set by human hands and reverses it to infectious joy. Oh, he knows how to connect. He knows how to connect. Well, what do we do with a lectionary besides use it? Well, we watch it. We watch it. We be aware of the ways it wants closure and finality, how it desires avoidance of the kind of juxtaposition in which preaching is launched. I think we need a fourth year that includes the stuff that's not in here, because it's a pretty narrow canon, let me say. Not just by what's not included at all, but how they've done with what they get, or what they give us. But the other things we need to be, we're always mindful of movement, of tension. But not just tension resolution. You heard me say that so many times, I was afraid that maybe you just thought that was all. Remember, we're talking in Aristotle plot line, where you don't just have tension, it grows, it gets bigger and bigger. The things get worse and worse and worse until finally there's a decisive turn. So you don't just do little tension resolution. And I want to say, keep the acoustical affair acoustical. Work out loud. Read out loud. You ought to read every text in every translation out loud so your ear can hear. And then when you start writing notes, to say that what you're about to write before you write it. If you say it after you write it, you won't, nothing will get picked up likely. But to say what you want to say, if you're at a computer, say it out loud so that you can hear what you hope others will bother to hear. And when you write, one of the great things is when you're in the car doing something else, paraphrase the text out loud. I don't carry a Bible in my left hand when I drive, nor a text thing either. At any rate, work out loud. Practice embodied speech. I'm talking about lingering and listening and looking. It was last November 14th, 10 days after the election. Bill Cosby was the guest of Letterman, and after the comedic part of the program, they sat down together, and Letterman said, "Could you share with me about your day on election day?" Now, you know what he could have said. He could have said, this was a historic moment, and hundreds have said that. He could have said, I was quite emotional about it. Dozens have said that. He could have said, I never thought it would happen in my lifetime. And many have said that. Why didn't he do that? Well, because of the language with which he works. Here's what he said. He said, well, I was at my desk and I reached for the frame of the picture of my father and took the picture out of the frame and put it in my pocket. I reached for the frame of my mother, pulled it out of the frame and put it in my pocket. And then I reached for the frame of my younger brother who died at the age of 6. I was 7 at the time, and put the picture in my pocket. My dad and my mother are dead now, and so is my brother. He said, I took him to the polls, pulled the curtain back, and I put him out. I put him out, and I said, now we are going to vote. The practice of imagination with particularity. Remember, Joseph Sittler, that imagination is not addition, it's always evocation. Or as he said to a PhD student one time, don't just preach what the text says. Preach what the text has prompted you to say. He said, you understand there's danger in that. It's called eisegesis, we know it. He said, but if you don't do that, you will never preach the full gospel. That's what Barbara Brown Taylor was doing when she had the light, had the woman move out of the light and then him move into the light, etc., etc. She was putting action to the movement of the text itself. Don't forget to delay resolution. You've heard it from Haddon Robinson. When the tension is gone, well, the sermon's over. Well, we've been talking about keeping time with the Word, the sheer facticity of temporal sequence, sermons, time after time after time, the strategies of suspense, the potential embodied forms that it takes, the sounds that it makes, the sound of the sermon. Yes, when the tension is gone, the sermon is over. And so is this lecture.